I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respects to the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land in which I live on today. I'd like to the elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders here today, also paying our respects to your elders past, present, and emerging. Next, please. This is our team of Smiles. Thom and Shurui, and Chelsea also helped us with the icon, and Andrew helped us out with trying to do some data analysis. Next, please. So why not the only one? Well, as I said before, this is about stories and racism and intersectionality. Now, I learned more by following people from marginalized groups and understanding the cumulative impact of racism. And this website is actually designed to squeeze 5 years of Twitter down into 5 minutes, because I think we need to get that moment. And here's an example here where it talks about the stress and the impact of racism on someone. Next, please. So this is the video. Hopefully I can be able to. So on the front page, you can see you can explore stories, and these are impact stories that are a particular category. We've got about 85 scheduled things now. Now I'm searching for a Brock Turner, which is a specific story that I know is actually in the database. And this is the idea that if in a wider context, if someone's searching for something, they'll see this, they'll click on it, and they'll see this side-by-side category where it's saying it's comparing two people being treated very, very differently by the justice system. And at the bottom, you can actually see the category side by side. So if people were interested, you could actually click on this and actually see that there are other stories that are similar to this. And in this one, I've only got 6 at the moment. We're going to click on this one around Tom Brady and which are football stars in America. And when they both walked off the field after a game, one was a fierce competitor and the other one was a classless thug. And so if you want to be able to share that side-by-side story, you can click on the link to be able to paste it into your social media chats to be able to say, hey, look, this is something that you might want to compare about, because people aren't treated the same. People aren't treated the same. So that gives you an idea of what you can do on the front end. But I think we're going to also show what can be done on the back end and how you curate these categories. So there's an option here called review, and these are for uncategorized stories. And when you click on review, it'll show you all these uncategorized stories. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on that, and then we're going to click on the first one, and we're going to categorize that. I'm hoping I'm talking at the same speed as the video. So if you click on that, and it actually goes through, and then you can categorize it, and then that will pop up onto the other one. So that's that slide. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The data flow. Tom, I was wondering if you could just, if you
sure.
want, you could
so
talk about these next 2 slides. Otherwise, I can do it.
To interact with the Twitter API. 2 different API. One is the enterprise level API in order to get the historical treats, and we also have part of the new beta program. We have their streaming service, which provides tweets matching on a rule in real time, and we use that to populate the database with new tweets, not just the historical ones. So that comes in through the Twitter API. It comes in, it builds out a model, which we then store in a database. We're not allowed to keep the text of the tweet according to Twitter's terms of service. So what we do is we actually generate what we call a high entropy feature set, which is removing usernames, removing any, if you're using natural language processing, they're called stop words. But there's things like to and and the, which don't really have any value in terms of entropy of the information. And then sharing it, we've built a front end where we've posted the link in the chat, and I can actually see there's a lot of people checking it out right now. And so, yeah, please check it out.
And what's the? Can you talk us really quickly, really quickly through the tech side? I guess next slide, please.
Cheers, Clement. So primarily it is a Flask framework, so written in Python. We've using generous use of jQuery and JavaScript to do all kinds of stuff. And then the front end UI is done with Formatic, which is a fork of Semantic, and as well as a whole bunch of custom CSS. We're using SQL Alchemy as a database driver. So on our dev computers, it's running on SQLite. On the server that we've deployed it to, it's running on Postgres. And then we've also used Xamarin, which is a C# to deploy out mobile apps and Electron for desktop apps. And we can see screenshots from my iPad and my desktop and yeah, all kinds of cool stuff.
Fantastic, fantastic. Next, do we have time for the next slides, which I can't remember? Okay, so future ideas. The idea here is, the underpinning idea for this is, how can I help marginalized people, and especially intersectional people, without taking their voices away? So a lot of this stuff that I put down here is community focused. And what I also want to be able to do is to take some of these stories and actually put them into practical situations and workshops, because I'm a very experiential teacher. And I think when I actually show what is actually happening, a lot of people will be able to start to understand the cumulative effects of systemic racism. And then we can actually start talking about real solutions. Next slide, please. So that's it from me, I think. And thank you very much to all of our sponsors. It was really, really fun to do this, even with the kids screaming in the background. Thanks very much.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Rowland and Thom. So will the judge please come up? Thank you.
Hey team, I love this one. And specific trying to do and the purpose. The one thing that I do see, especially from a Twitter perspective and the text, I'm curious about your curation process in terms of how do you going to how do you actually create that set that you want to share without necessarily presenting your own biases in terms of that content?
Yeah, right. So the idea here is, in theory, if you look at a normal research, qualitative research methodology, what you would end up doing is you would have two people who would be trained up, and you would get them to do these things independently, and then discuss how you would actually sort them out. But as one of my mentors, the linguist, says, we all have biases, and you're never going to get around those biases. So the key is to actually highlight where those biases are. And there's a really interesting quote that talks about power dynamics, Foucaultian power dynamics, that says, when you know, as a black person, it's not because I'm a black person that's the problem, it's because of the systemic power dynamics that are being applied to me. And so when you start to get a deeper level of that understanding of the biases, any biases that I might have would be less than what's actually out there at the moment. But more to your point, the idea would be to try and bring in some expertise to do some quality control checks. And because we have very high level categories at the moment, there's not really much very detailed curation that I'm thinking of at the moment, because it's very much a beginner's entry to why are these things happening. We might be able to get away with a light touch in terms of the quality control around the curation.
It's fine.
And a dislike button or something like that as well.
But no, appreciate the effort.
Thanks, team. It's Nina. Thanks to the not the only one. I think the name is very provocative, and I love the direction and the motivation behind it. I think it's very, very important. In the comments box on the right-hand side, there's the Everyday Sexism Project is about documenting everyday sexism experiences as well. So that might be something you want to look at. My concerns are around the categories. We didn't kind of see that, and there's a bit of a judgment and a kind of a classification. There's an assumption maybe around those. I'd love to hear a bit more about that. I'm interested to hear more about the Twitter being the source entry point, because a certain type of people use Twitter, and I'm worried that there's a certain type of racial experience that will be overrepresented by Twitter users, and other voices and different experiences might not be heard. For example, people who aren't on Twitter. And the side-by-side curation, I think, is pretty interesting. Have you had discussions about that duality, the us and them kind of presentation, if we're trying to move past that kind of duality thinking? Is there an option there to explore different ways of presenting that kind of layout? That's a big question. I think there's 3 in there. Did you have conversations about the curation and the implications of how it's digested?
Sorry, what was the question again? No, the reason for that being, like I said before, as you go through, and I think this might be tying in with your second question actually, which also ties in with what Jason was saying too. It was really clear as you go through and you look at Twitter, the lack of some of these stories that I would have gotten from other sources, and this question of, well, you know, maybe you're going to open people who are going in Twitter because they have certain kind of level of experiences. I think this is the brilliance of Twitter, actually, because before Twitter, there is no way in heck that I would have known about any of these stories. Talk about from 1938 that I have no idea about, and it's actually quite shocking. So the way I explain it, and I don't know if you can see my hands, and this is part of this other presentation that I have around capability maturity model for diversity in organizations. The current thinking that people have is that the systems are like this and everything's fine and we just need to be neutral. But it's actually really clear as you read these stories, the systems are like this. And because we're still thinking that they're neutral, we're just keeping that neutral. And what happens is that I could post, you know, biased Twitter things from now for the next 1,000 years, and I would not make a dent. I would not make a dent in all the other misrepresentations to marginalized groups that's happening just everywhere all the time. And so I'm not necessarily worried about that, because this is more to bring balance to that systems approach. And I think when you think about these things, and I think this is one of the key things that I'd like to, oh, there's the kids right now. Oh, that's much better. One of the things that I really want to sort of explain is when you think of this as individual things or smaller systems, it doesn't make sense. My stuff doesn't make sense. You worry about my biases and you worry about the biases of the people who are on Twitter and the biases of those people, but we don't actually think about the biases that are currently in the system at the moment. And I think this is the conversation starter to have those conversations.
Hey, Rowland. So I think the events of the past few months have made it clear that conversation starters around racism are absolutely critical. And I love the premise of the tool and the way it's been put together. I have a technical question about the NLP method. So that side-by-side view is actually pretty incredible. And the fact that you can pull out, you know, that from Twitter to have these similar sorts of messages, like how is that done? Like, can you speak a little bit to the technical algorithm?
It's done because a lot of people, Oh, hang on.
Sure. Yeah,
Tom,
so
do
it
you
all
want to answer
starts to begin with the Twitter
Tom, did you want to
account,
answer that?
NTIO_org, which is a curated Twitter account by Rowland, and he's actually quoted or retweeted these tweets. We then use the Twitter API to ingest that and store metadata, but not the actual text, because that's a no-no. And then what we spent a lot of time doing is like we've looked at using sentiment analysis, and we've even pulled in a professional data analysis, or Andrew, the organizer. And unfortunately, the data is just too messy to do classification kind of machine learning on that. So we decided the best way to go forward is actually using a manual curation process. And I might see if I can share my screen. So this is what it looks like. If you are an admin or a user with the reviewer role, you will have some additional ones. So admins get the dashboard, reviewers get the review. So within the dashboard, we have all of our various admin-y kind of stuff, but part of it is also the categories. And so for ones we've set up here are allyship, Black Lives Matter, exhausting, gallery, impact, and side-by-side. So obviously we can go into these, we could rename it, we can see all the various things, but more importantly, we can use these in our review. So we do have a backlog, so this is actually going to be quite long, but we could go into here, and I'm just going to search for we can see here's one that deals with Black Lives Matter, and we have looked at using hashtags, but unfortunately we can't just assume, because unfortunately Twitter is a bad place, and Rowland has picked up some bad tweets as well, which are examples used in the side-by-side. But we can go in, we get the view, and this is all a callback using the Twitter widget, which is where we get the text from. And we can say, is it a thread? Should we allow this to be seen on the website? And if yes, and then we can add a category.